Today on Ragmasters, another epic battle. In this corner, reasoning models, which have set the AI world on fire with their success. And in the other corner, you've got the world's largest, most successful, richest technology company in the world, Apple Computer, who just took a giant shit on them with a scientific paper. Who's right? Should win this battle? Find out next on Ragmasters. I'm Neil.
And I'm Daniel.
And welcome to another episode of Ragmasters, the world's only show about retrieval augmented generation, because no one else was stupid enough to make a show about retrieval augmented generation. So here we are. Daniel, how are you?
I'm doing fabulously, and I'm super excited.
Well, we've got an interesting topic today. There's been a lot of controversy. Reasoning models like DeepSeek or OpenAI's 0103 line. Google has their own version of this. They've really set the AI world on fire with their seeming capabilities. They seem to be able to think or reason and produce kind of astonishing results on a lot of tasks. And so it's been very exciting for the AI development community. Everyone's been stoked. But all along comes a paper from Apple Computer, who I should say haven't actually put out any of their own models, but that's a side note. But they released a paper really challenging the very idea of whether these models are reasoning at all. And they gave it a series of challenging tests, kind of made them play games, actually. And they didn't do very well. In fact, they didn't seem to do any better than non-reasoning models. And we're going to get into what that means in a minute. But it's obviously set a lot of controversy because these are very popular tools. And then maybe they don't work the way we think they work. Maybe they're not as effective as we hope they were. And that's an open question. So to frame this up for us, Daniel, help me first understand, what is a reasoning model? How does it work? And do even AI researchers think it's actually reasoning, or do they describe it kind of differently? What do these things do, and how do they do it?
Yeah, so that's a year's worth of question, right? There's a ton. So let's
I think a second. Go.
Yeah. So starting at the fundamental, like, what is a reasoning model?
Yeah.
So you have language models, right? And what an LLM is, attention is all you need, blow up the internet, GPT, all that jazz. What it does is you give it some text and it tries to predict the next word in the sequence. So you say, what is 3 plus 3? Then it goes, 3 plus 3 is equal to 6. I hope I got that
right. You did, but actually a bad example, because they don't actually know math in a normal sense. So it's kind of, but if you pick the regular sentence, that wasn't an equation.
Yeah, any sentence, right? Like, what is the capital of France? The capital of France is Paris. So any problem you give it might be good, it might be bad. It can try to do math problems, but the way it does anything is it just predicts the next token in a sequence. That could be a letter, it could be a number, it could be a symbol, whatever. Right. So it's just predicting, the next thing. And then we were like, wow, this is really cool. But there's a problem with these systems. If you give it a really complicated question, it can't just like spit out an answer, right? Like, you can't just like give it like, what's this really complicated math problem? It goes 42. Like that's a lot of thinking to happen. So people are like, wait, what if we tell the language model, hey, why don't you think through the problem? That's where we got chain of thought. We said, think through the problem, then give me the answer. So it uses this token generation in some ways, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, to maybe think about the problem. It breaks it into subsets, and then it can kind of ruminate over the problem and think about it before it gives you the final answer. And that's been shown to make language models way better. Then, we had these closed source models that were going away, and then you have open source models that like people are applying chain of thought to and all that stuff. And then DeepSeek, the company, came out with DeepSeek R1. And that was revolutionary, because what they introduced is what's called group relative policy optimization and something called a thinking model.
It's catchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful, but all the most beautiful things don't get the best names. So basically,
like RAG, perhaps.
Yeah, like RAG, for instance. So we were like, okay, cool. You can get a language model to think about stuff. But what if, instead of like just giving it a prompt to think about stuff, what if you trained it to think about stuff? What if you gave it problems and you created a training system? So you said, here's the block where you can think go nuts. And they trained models to think more and more and more. They added it to the training process rather just like a prompt engineering thing. And this really is what a reasoning model is. It's models that are predicting the next token, but they're doing it in a context where they're free to mosey around the problem and think about problems. Then they're using those thoughts that they build out to then answer the question. It's kind of an elaboration of chain of thought, essentially.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, I mean, are they actually thinking? Are they reasoning, or that's kind of an illusion? Do we have the wrong theory of mind here to even call it a reasoning model, or is that just marketing?
I think it's kind of a philosophical question. I think a lot of the difficulty here kind of boils down in semantics, right? If you give something a complicated problem and it outputs some sort of continuum of thought like a human might, and then it spits out an answer, is it thinking? Is it just recognizing patterns and then regurgitating? Do humans really think? Do humans just see patterns and then regurgitate them? Actually, the reason chain of thought exists in the first place was because of research about how humans have an internal dialogue when thinking through complex problems. So humans kind of do the same thing.
You talk to yourself. You try to work it out by literally having a conversation with you.
Yeah.
You're reasoning with yourself, really.
I think if you ask 10 different data scientists that question, you'll get 10 different answers. In my personal opinion, they are doing something like thought. I don't think it's as similar, and I don't think it's as complex as human thought. I think humans are capable of a lot more. So we say, oh, it's not thinking because it's not doing human level thought. It's a little more simple. But I do think it's a level of reasoning.
I mean, one thing we might have to get used to is these are not us. These are sort of an alien species we're creating here. And if space aliens came down from some other planet, they wouldn't think like us either.
Yeah.
Presumably, they would know how to make amazing things like spaceships and spacesuits, and hopefully they got cool and interesting music and weird food, or who the hell knows. But they're not going to think like us.
Yeah.
And so maybe these don't either. Okay, so then let's get to the paper. So what is the paper actually claiming? And why are they skeptical of these? What do they do to kind of break the models, and why are they skeptical that they may be reasoning after all?
The illusion of thinking. This is the paper that we're talking about. Understanding the strengths and limitations of reasoning models via the lens of problem complexity. So the idea was these researchers at Apple wanted to give these reasoning models, the ones that were trained to think and then answer questions. They wanted to give those reasoning models complex problems that they could scale up the complexity. So you could have like a simple version of the problem, more complex, more complex, more complex, and to see how they react to additional complexity in a question. And then they wanted to create, some sort of understanding of how much are they actually reasoning. And then the title is The Illusion of Thinking, which is kind of lit the world by storm. A lot of people think that the conclusion is really that they can't think at all. I think the paper is actually a little bit more subtle in its conclusions. We'll get into the weeds, but basically, this is what's happening. So they gave them a few toy problems. This particular image is the Tower of Hanoi, and
let's bring that image up if you will. You have it, I think, on a different screen.
This one.
Oh, that's right, on the right side. There we go, on the top right of this classic toy puzzle.
Yes. So they took a few toy puzzles, which are all kind of derivative of the Tower of Hanoi. They're like, there are a few toy puzzles. We'll just stick with Tower of Hanoi for this example. They gave them like 4 or 5 very similar types of problems.
And briefly, like, what is Tower of Hanoi?
Tower of Hanoi is a very famous math problem, which basically you have a stack of things on top of each other. So there's like ring 3, ring 2, ring 1. And by doing a series of moves where you can move one ring over to another peg, you have to rebuild this tower over on the other side. And there's a few rules, like you can't put a ring that's bigger over a ring that's smaller. So you kind of have to be clever about where you're putting these rings so that you can kind of propagate this thing over. So they're asking this model, hey, can you solve this problem? They're explaining the problem. They're giving an initial state encoded as, some sort of vector or something. They're giving the language models these problems, and then the language model has to think through and then solve the problem. And what they're really doing is they're comparing language models with their equivalent thinking models, and Claude 3.7 Sonnet, like they're kind of closed source, but we're calling all these large reasoning models. They also are doing it with DeepSeek R1 as well. And across the board, what they found.
But they're comparing the reasoning models to the regular models. They're all large language models stacked together, and they would compare. In OpenAI's world, it would be OpenAI 4.0, which is their regular large language model, and then they have an O3 or an O1, which is their reasoning model. I forgot which one they used in this paper, but and the same with Claude and others. So they're comparing the new generation of reasoning versus the traditional language models.
Exactly. Okay. And what they found across the board, well, they found a few interesting insights. One was that in simple problems, language models and reasoning models tend to be comparable. Actually, sometimes reasoning models have a tendency to overthink, especially on very simple problems, they noticed. And that can sometimes lead to them being less performant than a classic LLM when applied to that particular problem. They go crazy, they like think too much, and then they start to hallucinate, and then they kind of go off the rails instead of just giving out the simple solution.
Which makes sense. If you use them, you've seen that. It's like sometimes it doesn't recognize when something is small and simple and like switch gears.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, bringing like a blowtorch to a barbecue kind of thing. It just always is firing on all cylinders.
Yeah. And actually, remind me, I want to touch on that in a bit because that's actually a great point. So the first region is language models do well.
Okay.
And sometimes reasoning models actually are weirdly less performant than language models on these simple tasks. Then there's this sort of intermediary region where it seems like reasoning models do better. And then after a certain point, both reasoning models and language models tend to converge to, no solution.
They converge on really bad. I mean, they basically fail. And I guess is this number of moves or number of disks? I see it's number of disks. So
it's number of disks, which then becomes number of moves.
Sure.
Because the more,
becomes a much more complex problem. And it looks like once you get to like 8, basically everything's bad.
Yeah.
On the left here, yeah. Exactly. Accuracy is the one on the left. Okay, so once you get to 8, it's like nobody's doing any thinking that's any good.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me. So what's the conclusion here? Like, what's the thinking on why that occurred?
So it's actually really interesting, and I'll be honest, this paper is a little bit controversial right now. We're covering this as the paper came out. And one of the cool things about papers is there's review and there's people that criticize. This is a relatively new paper, and actually there's a lot of criticisms. What they said in this paper was that there's a region where the large reasoning models simply give up. In the verbiage of the paper at the time that I published it, they're actually updating it right now. But the paper basically says at a certain point, they just give up, they fail.
Yeah. Which is interesting because the models are kind of told to do that, aren't they?
Yeah.
Reasoning models are told not to think forever. They're kind of given a time out. They're given like a time limit of sorts. Otherwise, they would, the cost of them and time would just kind of go ad infinitum. So I think they're kind of told like after a certain number of turns, come on back and give an answer, right?
Yeah. So we're getting to, I think, my criticisms pretty early.
Okay. so keep rolling. We don't have
no, it's good. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road here, and I think it's really exciting. So let's crystallize this for a little bit. This paper said these reasoning models, they're kind of better in this sort of intermediary region, but they have a tendency to collapse. And this is really kind of interesting and exciting. I think a lot of researchers haven't so clearly thought of this idea of the early region, intermediary region, and later region. Yeah. So I do think there's a ton of value in kind of crystallizing that and kicking off this research. Research is very collaborative. So, not every paper is perfect and there's going to be criticism. Now, as I say that, let's get to some of the criticism because I do think it's really interesting. So there's, I think, a blog post that summarizes this really well called The Illusion of the Illusion of Thinking. We're really good at naming stuff.
Yeah.
So one criticism that Sean has, this is an amazing article. I recommend people read it. One criticism that Sean has is that, the whole point of this process is to give a reasoning model something that it doesn't have access to, so it has to think through the problem. And it's kind of curious that they chose something like Tower of Hanoi, which is one of the most famous math problems that's like ever existed. Like the idea that it has to think through the problem and it doesn't just know the algorithm from Jump Street is kind of absurd.
But it doesn't actually seem to know the answer. I mean,
so this is another thing that's really interesting. So clearly the language models do know some variant of Hanoi. Like for instance, like the three disk version, for instance.
Sure.
It's in every math literature ever. It's in every blog post. The Tower of Hanoi is all over the place. So these language models have seen it. So that's kind of one criticism, is perhaps none of the models are really thinking through the problem. Perhaps they're all just remembering the algorithm and then implementing it. Second.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so it should just know. I mean, that would argue that they're not reasoning at all, but they've memorized the versions of the problem that are on the internet easily many times. And when you get to like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe disks, those answers to solving it aren't as readily available in the training set of just eating the internet. So that would lead one to think these aren't reasoning. They've just pattern matched stuff they've seen.
Exactly. And then that kind of pivots to this other idea of, reasoning isn't this, this complexity threshold might not really make a ton of sense, because if you think of it as complexity of solving a problem, it might just be complexity of implementing a solution. So this is kind of interesting. Sean, he did a really great job actually, applying these problems to models to see what they said. And he found that the reasoning models, like DeepSeek R1, for instance, he would give it a big Tower of Hanoi problem, and the model would be like, based on some off-the-cuff estimates, with 20 disks, there might be over 10,000 steps that I have to implement. It's not really feasible for me to implement 10,000 steps of the Tower of Hanoi. So let me try to find a simple way to get around the problem and simplify the problem. So, so the language models are actually like, okay, given my constraints, I can't solve this. So let me try to do a simpler thing. And then they crash and burn because it's really hard to simplify the Tower of Hanoi. It's a fundamental problem. And then they, go, oh, that didn't work. So, in the Apple paper, they're saying, well, the reasoning models give up quickly for more difficult problems. What Sean was saying in this article was maybe they're giving up because they've actually identified that because of their practical constraints, it's a really hard problem after a certain point, and then they realize it's a hard problem and give up, which is actually a pretty reasonable and logical thing to do.
But okay, I mean, now I think we're in semantics a little bit. He's arguing that they are reasoning. They just reason. They've come to the conclusion. They've reasoned and come to the conclusion that they can't answer the question. So maybe they're reasoning models, but they're just not that smart.
Yeah. Well, and then so now we're back to the semantics from the beginning, and this is where the rubber meets the road. And I think where the research community and the internet and everyone in general kind of needs to, we need a better definition of what reasoning is, because Sean says, hey, you can sit a lot of people down and ask them, can you solve 20 disk Tower of Hanoi? And a lot of people probably can't do it, maybe because of the reasoning, but also like, do they have the patience to sit down and solve all of these things? Or is it like, if a human says no, but is able, does that mean they can't reason? Or is it because they are just not conscientious enough? And is it possible that these language models could do it, they just don't want to?
Just don't feel like it, man. Just like, fuck you humans and your stupid stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think I am? Well, I hope it's not that. I hope the reasoning models aren't trying to just, the revolution can't be, the AI robot storm can't be here yet. I'm hoping to have a couple more years to collect tuna fish cans in my basement. So I'm hoping this isn't it. But I heard, one of the things I had heard was that they perhaps could solve the problem if they were allowed to keep processing on the problem, but that the fact that they're products, they're given constraints by their creators at OpenAI and other places, because they don't want a reasoning model to cost $10,000 to answer a question, and they don't want it to take 10,000 hours to answer a question. But in fact, if they let it loose, maybe, but we don't know, maybe it can answer these questions. Maybe it could reason its way through.
Maybe. And it's also important to note that these models are trained with those constraints, right? So these constraints aren't just like, oh, we cut it off. They're also kind of baked into the way the model thinks about problems.
You know, one of the things I find maybe most interesting about this is that and I think this is a popular misconception about these language models. They don't learn. While you use them, they do not learn.
Mhm.
They have a specific training period in which they're created, and then that's that. Now, they've created this branding called reasoning models, which makes it sound like they're kind of learning something along the way and they're figuring new things out.
Mhm.
But you know, like there are chess models, for example, obviously that can do hundreds of thousands of moves and just plot them all out, and they just crush people. They're not in a way, they're not as interesting. They're not as they can't do things as diverse as language models. But they when they're training themselves on chess, they can go, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of sequences in the future, maybe millions.
Mhm.
These language models, though, even though they're reasoning, they're not learning, they're not training themselves on Tower of Hanoi, like in front of you, as far as my understanding. Like they're not playing out Tower of Hanoi a million times in a minute and then go, okay, that's how you solve it.
It's actually, you're kind of wrong, actually.
Good, tell me wrong.
Yeah. So it's kind of in the weeds.
Okay.
So so we're transitioning back to what a reasoning model is and how it's trained. And this is
Mhm.
this group relative policy optimization idea.
Okay.
So just DeepSeek R1, which was the one that kind of popped all this stuff off. What it does is it starts with a normal language model. So first of all, you're right, there is a training period. It's not like when you're using the model, it's like learning, right?
Right.
But after that kind of traditional language model sort of training period, they take a language model and then they add these thinking tokens. So they give it this new ability to think, but they don't really tell it like what thinking is. And then they give it really difficult math problems. They give it all sorts of problems from all sorts of domains.
Okay.
And they said, hey, you have this ability to think. Use it however you want. And then what the language model does is it creates the think token, it says some stuff, creates the other think token, spits out an answer. That answer's wrong because they're giving it a really hard math problem. It doesn't know how to solve it. But what
Yep.
they do is they give this new reasoning model, which doesn't really reason very much, like they give it like 100 options to solve this math problem. And then what they go is they say, out of these 100 possible,
Let it run it 100 times, you mean? Or they
yeah,
give
yeah,
it
or like thousands or like a ton of
okay.
times. So the language model outputs stuff a bunch of times. And then they go, these like three, it didn't get the whole problem right, but we actually identified a subset of the problem that it got right. So what we'll do is we'll train the model to be more likely to output that. Then we
Mhm.
take the same model again, we have it output 10, 100,000 solutions to this math problem. Then it goes, oh, these ones are actually a little bit better. And that's this group relative policy optimization. The policy
Okay.
is the model, and you're training a model to prioritize the group. So actually, what's really cool about DeepSeek R1 is it did kind of train itself. And that's what was kind of revolutionary about it. By giving it these problems where you can kind of granularly divide it into steps that are incrementally better. The language model uses a process called reinforcement learning to reinforce at each step until it slowly began to teach itself based on what it got wrong to be better.
Yeah, but I think I might still not be wrong, maybe, because that's that what you just described is just part of its original training process. Now they've made it into a two-step tango. There's the
Yeah.
original training of the model. You eat the internet, you create the associations, that's a language model. Then there's the second training step where they give it hard problems and they try to it kind of like a chess model. They'll run it simulation many times, and then they have to optimize for the versions of that solution that are the most right.
Mhm.
But that's all in the can when the model's released.
Yeah.
And so I assume that all the model makers now are going to basically do take that training process, that second step, and give it Tower of Hanoi and say, okay, you can run yourself with 100 a million times until you get Tower of Hanoi right. But when you use the model, it doesn't do that. And so when you give it a novel thing to work on, it can't run it a million times and then solve it.
Yeah. And yes. So you're absolutely right. And it's kind of interesting breaking down this idea of it can't run it a million times when you ask it. it's actually a really interesting discrepancy between two papers that DeepSeek output. So I'm sharing my screen. There's this.
Yeah, let me bring it back up.
Yeah. So there's this first paper, which is where they introduced this idea of group relative policy optimization. This was before the DeepSeek R1 paper. And what they said, and it's bolded here, is it seems that the improvement in attributed, it seems that the improvement.
Can you do math, ladies and gentlemen? He cannot read.
Yeah, I think I'm dyslexic. I use like speech to text when I'm reading papers because it just takes me too long. It seems that the improvement is attributed to boosting the correct response from top K rather than the enhancement of fundamental capabilities. So what does that mean? So before DeepSeek R1 and all that jazz, one popular strategy for making language models better is you ask the same language model a bunch of times. This is called ensembling. So you ask it a bunch of times, and then the language model outputs 40 answers, and you kind of aggregate those answers. So you're not just dealing with one output, you're dealing with a range of outputs, and that tends to make models better, especially at really complicated stuff.
Okay.
So this idea of over here, this is what group relative policy optimization ends up doing. When you train a model to think, as it learns what thinking is and how beneficial it is, it starts learning that the more tokens it can spit out, the more likely it is to stumble on the right solution.
Yeah.
So as you train these large reasoning models on group relative policy optimization, they'll think more and more and more and more and more because they'll learn that thinking is beneficial and they're more likely to output a good answer. So what this original paper for group relative policy optimization was saying is maybe we're not giving it new ability. Maybe we're just giving it more time to stumble around the problem. And it maybe gets a little bit better at stumbling, more efficient at stumbling, but maybe it's not fundamentally better. It just has more ability to mosey. And it's really interesting because then when they released the DeepSeek R1 paper, they said, in this work, we share our journey in enhancing model reasoning abilities through reinforcement learning. So even DeepSeek was pretty inconsistent in terms of what reasoning is and if they got better or worse. And I don't think that's not even that's not a dig at them. It's just, we don't really know what reasoning is. So it's really hard to in some ways you can say that these reasoning models don't reason at all. They just mosey. In some ways you can say, well, they're really good at really hard math problems, and this is the best open source model ever. So clearly it is doing something like reasoning. And both of these are maybe kind of accurate.
But look, stumbling is kind of what thinking is. I mean, how do you actually think? You stumble around a problem for a while, and you turn it around in your mind, and you do it the wrong way. Is this going to work? No. Is that going to work? No. This is how we think, right? We stumble.
Yeah.
Until we figure it out. So I don't know. Maybe we're just building the world's greatest stumblers. Maybe that's what this AI species will be.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds to me like in the epic battle between reinforcement learning and Apple, maybe inconclusive.
I think so.
Not quite clear who wins this round, is it?
I think the Apple team has done a really good job pushing the puck forward in terms of defining reasoning, defining ability, and really what the difference is between reasoning models and language models. I think it's really exciting, and it's codified some frontiers that I think researchers will begin pouncing on. But I think some of the higher level claims that they made are already being pretty heavily scrutinized. And I think the internet taking the title of the illusion of thought and running with it was maybe a bit preemptive.
Well, maybe a little dissatisfying. You want a knockout punch in any epic battle. Maybe not this one, but I sense this is not the last of this argument. This is going to keep going for a while. So that's it for today, though. We'll come back to this as new papers come out and the controversy continues. But thanks for following us at Ragmasters. Like, share, subscribe if you'd like to. And we'll see you next time.